Welcome to the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. I am Tzili Mor, Chair of the Human Rights and Immigration Subcommittee of the International Law Community at the DC Bar. Over the next few months, we will talk about and spotlight the international principles and standards that govern national elections. We will speak to eminent experts in the field and have posted an extensive list of resources on global elections and electoral standards on the DC Bar's International Law Community webpage. So why now? Well, of course, the right to vote is the most basic right in a democracy, and these standards are always important, and they are especially critical this year. And not only because the US will have its presidential election. 2024 through 2025 have been dubbed the year of elections, or the super elections year. This year, over half of the world's population, 4.2 billion people, have or will be voting in over 80 national elections, making this year the biggest election year in history. This will be the largest election cycle the world will see until 2048. And so, the DC Bar International Law Community, in a series of podcasts and webinars, will consider what makes elections free and fair and genuinely aligned with international standards for democratic elections. Is there consensus about those standards? Where are they rooted? What are some of the key commitments for advancing genuine and credible elections? What makes elections democratic? Do states follow these standards? What conditions are needed to maximize compliance? And so today we're privileged to host one of the most renowned global election experts, Pat Merloe. Pat has participated in over 190 missions in more than 65 countries concerning political rights, electoral integrity, and democratic development. He served as the principal drafter and negotiator of the Declaration of Principles for International Election Observation, endorsed by more than 50 international organizations. He also facilitated the production of a corresponding declaration on election observation by nonpartisan citizen groups. He was also a co-leader in developing the newly launched Model Commitments for Advancing Genuine and Credible Elections, a joint effort of 5 leading organizations in the international elections arena. Pat is also a member of the DC Bar. He started his legal career with a large firm in San Francisco, where he was an active bar association member. He also taught courses in international human rights and international law. So, Pat, you were engaged in domestic, civil, and political rights advocacy before becoming an attorney. And in San Francisco, you led the bar's International Human Rights Committee while practicing with a large firm. So how did you cross that bridge to focusing globally on elections?
Well, first, Tzili, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this conversation and for chairing this committee. I think that it's the work of lawyers in the arena of international human rights, and certainly the fundamental rights of each citizen, including elections, is truly important. So I'm really pleased that the DC Bar is taking this on, and your leadership, not just here, but we have had the privilege of working together in the past. So I have to start there. My story is a simple one, really. I like to say, like some other people in this town, I'm a blue-collar kid from upstate Pennsylvania who made my way through a number of things, old enough to have been really affected by the civil rights movement and work in my student days in Philadelphia against police brutality and for accountability in that arena. And as I moved on, really 10 years later, after a stint here in DC doing policy advocacy work, I picked up the international human rights side of this. I always had that interest. So the bridge from there to the last 30 years really was a short one. Doing some work while I was in San Francisco with groups like what is now called Human Rights First and Global Rights, I decided that I would volunteer to go take a leave from my firm and go to Bulgaria and Romania to help in 1990 with people who wanted to do the transition from their one-party states to a more democratic future, and to engage with citizen groups around that and help the Lawyers Committee and others to identify the partners with whom they might work over the next couple of years. And through that, I met the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs, which not many people know of. It was founded by Walter Mondale, Madeleine Albright, Andy Young, Jerry Ferraro, a whole bunch of, fancy people and great names and wonderful histories to help people overseas. Volunteering with it over the next 3 years from my base in San Francisco, it really combined my interest in law, the rule of law, human rights, and political development, which of course is at the root of all of this. So it wasn't so hard to make that crossover. I was not an elections expert. And out of the blue, when I got called and asked to take on that role, I sort of laughed about it. But the head of NDI at the time said, "Oh, well, you will be."
And important to note that the National Democratic Institute, or NDI, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to support and strengthen democratic institutions in other countries worldwide. And on issues of democratic elections in particular, NDI works closely with sister organization, the International Republican Institute, or IRI, often issuing joint international election observation statements. And both NDI and IRI do not engage in U.S. elections or political processes. And so with this incredible experience of, almost 200 missions, what were some of the gaps, especially in the beginning, that you saw that prompted the need for defining some global principles around elections, election monitoring, electoral advocacy, kind of the evolution of those standards? And then how have those instruments that have been developed over the past few decades addressed those gaps? Have they been effective?
Yeah, well, maybe we need to, break this out a little bit. I mean, in the period in the early 90s, and I won't go deep, into that, the idea of elections then, and in many, ways even still, was divorced from the fundamental principles of human rights. They were sort of seen as a political exercise rather than what we would look at this from the perspective of international law and human rights. So the first point was to help drive home that sovereignty residing in the people of the country, if you accept that as the democratic principle upon which governance derives its authority, its will, only takes place, through elections. So the idea that in the international human rights instruments to bring that to life was the first challenge, right? So helping to see that what are the elements of that? I mean, first, it has to be based on people developing and holding beliefs without interference, and to do that through seeking and receiving trustworthy information. So you could look at Article 19 in the Declaration or in the ICCPR, and based on that, to freely express their will without undue burdens through universal and equal suffrage. Well, what is universal and equal suffrage? I mean, it is fundamentally, it is the non-discrimination norm. So it's not just doing that without the types of discrimination that are generally recognized in international human rights. It also has to do with holding political beliefs and so on. And so the idea of equality before the law is really at the core of universal and equal suffrage. And not only equality before the law, but equal protection of the law when you are somehow abridged in your seeking to get information, to register to vote, and to have that vote be accurately recorded, or to stand for office, that there have to be effective remedies. So that leads us to due process and enforcement of remedies. So I won't go on, but we can imagine how in the early days, being able to somehow make this connection and ground the work around elections in the broader work of democratic governance and the rule of law, that was a fundamental challenge at the beginning, and frankly, it still carries through to today.
And continuing with that idea, do you have concerns about actors, state or non-state actors, ignoring, subverting, or even co-opting these kind of global election standards, some of which you've just mentioned?
So yes, it is an important, consideration, because most of the people who are working to undermine democracy in any given country are people who are abusing power themselves. They're domestic actors. On the other hand, there are almost always transnational actors who are also concerned either with undermining the governments for geopolitical reasons or international criminal syndicates who are looking for state capture. And so there are at work always a number of actors in a mix that varies from country to country. And how to get at those actors is an important challenge that has to be taken on both by international community through observation and diplomacy, but also to empower the citizens in a given country to be able to identify, address, expose, and create accountability around that.
Is there an example that comes to mind where that has worked well?
Well, there are plenty of examples. I mean, one example that's in the news this week is the referendum that took place on Sunday in Moldova about whether to move towards accession to the European Union. And what happened in the course leading up to that vote was tremendous interference by Moscow, both through mis and disinformation campaigns and through the illegal, transborder shipment of funds to promote those who were working against the referendum. I mean, as we know, nonetheless, the pro-EU session vote eked out a victory in that. Now, there was a great deal of effort by governmental agencies within Moldova to expose those activities and work by both political and citizen groups to educate fellow citizens about the nature of those things and to call on them to be able to make up their mind without having that kind of interference in the beliefs that they would develop and then the choice that they would make. So there's an example that is right before us and very current.
That is encouraging. And I'm wondering, maybe more broadly, if you've seen or you could talk about some trends of compliance or lack of compliance that you could identify in some of the recent elections during this historic year of elections.
Well, there have been really dramatic examples internationally, of course. One that comes to mind in a different part of the world is Guatemala. So in Guatemala, there was a really clear and decisive victory on the part of the opposition in the form of a presidential candidate who was an anti-corruption reformer. And those who had held power in Guatemala for some time before the election first disqualified the primary opponent. And then as another person came forward with the nomination and the candidacy, tried to undermine that person. And when the results were announced, tried to undermine the results. So they tried to block a peaceful transfer of power. Interestingly, citizen groups in that country had done a lot of work in monitoring the election processes, including a very sophisticated verification of the voting results, and were able to, in real time, come forward and say that the results were valid, which helped the international community, including the Organization of American States, which had an observer delegation present, and the European Union, which had an observer delegation present, to help expose that there was a manipulation and pressure being put on the election commission to overturn the results. And that led to a diplomatic effort by many countries, which helped eventually the results to be accepted and the transition to take place. So that was a really excellent example of how all of these things can come together in a sort of positive ecosystem, if you will, based first upon citizen efforts, and second, based upon the role of the international community in helping to reinforce that. It's not so positive everywhere. There was a somewhat similar circumstance in Sierra Leone. And in that case, those who held power were able to prevail and to remain in office, even though there had been a verification of the result that would have called for a runoff. And the international group in that community began to put pressure on, but because of other geopolitical problems in the region, they backed off. So it doesn't always work the way we'd like to see it work, but there are examples of where it does.
These are really interesting examples. I was wondering if you could sort of talk us through a little bit about, one of the issues that have come up in recent elections has been around protection of voters and electoral workers and sort of rising threats and violence against those groups, including citizen observers. And I know those are standards around which you've worked. If you could sort of talk a bit more about what that phenomena has been like and how the standards that you've been working on have been put in place to mitigate that issue.
Yeah, that's really a great question. So, I mean, again, as where I started, and perhaps not so eloquently, is that this is all about citizens of a country being able to exercise their free will and to really lay the basis for the authority of government. And so, not only do citizens have the right to vote and the right to stand for office, but they have the right to know that the election process is a genuine process and that the outcome is a valid outcome, which then leads to, of course, the ability to associate, to create organizations, and to monitor election processes, as well as the right of journalists and news media to look into these things and to be able to explore what is the quality of the election, various election processes in every given country. So, one of the things that I really helped to emphasize when I began working on this 30 years ago, and part of what attracted me to the National Democratic Institute's approach was that not just going in as international observers, but really to work with citizen groups to help the citizen groups gain the skills that they needed to do this kind of monitoring and advocacy and legal reform within their own countries, both legislatively and administratively and so on. So that moved from a really dramatic example in history, the 1986, the Philippine election with Aquino and Marcos, where eventually a citizen group had mobilized, with the help of the Catholic Church and others, almost 500,000 people to monitor the polling stations in the Philippines and to collect copies of the election results and to post those, tabulate those, and post those publicly. That helped to show that Aquino won the election. And people within the election commission, a number of women who were the computer operators, came forward to the main cathedral in town and exposed that the numbers that were being put up by the election commission did not correspond to the numbers they were putting into the computer system. That really put a factual basis to what became people power. And of course, we know things changed in the Philippines. And from that, NDI's observation team took away the importance of helping people in other countries develop the capacities that the citizens had developed in the Philippines, which eventually spread. I won't go through all of the steps in this, but spread around the world to where now, more than 90 countries, there's very strong nonpartisan citizen groups that operate based on the Declaration of Nonpartisan Principles and are linked together through regional networks and a global network. And simultaneously have been able to make connections with the main international election observation organizations, including the United Nations, and I could go on and on about them. And they've been able to help each other gain acceptance so that it's evolved to a point where when we look at elections now, we expect that there will be invited international observers and that there will be accredited nonpartisan observers, in addition to the roles that political party poll watchers and so on play. So that, I think, has become a very important dynamic. And last year, the special rapporteurs for freedom of assembly and freedom of association at the United Nations and the Organization of American States issued a joint statement recognizing election observers as human rights defenders. And that included both the international and citizen observers. So this is an evolution that shows some of the progress in the efforts that have taken place. And I think it's at part of the question you asked.
Absolutely. And so, given all of that, and given that here in the United States, there have been some expressed concerns around election integrity issues and voting access, what should we, as lawyers in the international legal field, should be looking out for in our own upcoming elections here in the US?
Yeah, unfortunately, many of the issues that I've worked on overseas for 3 decades, we can now identify here in the United States, really since 2000. I mean, the most important thing, perhaps, in points I've been trying to make is that citizens, in order to have a real sense of the authority and legitimacy of government, have to believe that the election process was a genuine process and that their will was honored in the outcome of the election. And the big lie that has been promoted that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen has really infiltrated the consciousness of a great, percentage of the population in this country, which has helped to destabilize not only public trust in elections, but even has brought about threats to election officials of both political parties and independents who have worked, to bring about credible elections in this country for decades. So I don't need to go into all the details because I'm sure anyone who would be listening to this podcast has probably followed this as closely as you or I have. So we're now at a point where there really have to be extraordinary steps taken to reassure the public. And that really is based upon transparency of the processes. Many of the election administrators around the country have stepped up their efforts to allow the population to understand how these intricate processes work. There has to be inclusion of the media and groups from various sides in understanding that. And there has to be accountability, as we've seen through so many different kinds of court cases, including cases that have gone after people who have harassed and threatened and even carried out attacks on election facilities around the country. So that's only one of the challenges in our particular environment, but that's certainly a new challenge. And we could go on about misinformation and disinformation of various types and other things. But unfortunately, we have a circumstance now in this country where we have to pay a lot of attention to the credibility and public confidence in our elections.
Yeah, it's a little bit like going back to basics, right? The credibility of the process itself as foundational. Well, thank you so much, Pat, for your time and these insights and examples from around the world. We're really pleased to have had this time with you. For those of you who are interested in more information about some of those global standards and resources that we mentioned, again, they're posted on the DC Bar's International Law Community webpage, and we welcome you to go and peruse them. Next month, we will discuss global election standards with a focus on Europe. So we have a good start with Moldova. In December, we will look at how the US election stood up to these global standards, and we hope to then follow it up by a session focused on elections in the Americas more broadly. Thank you for listening, and please, if eligible, go and vote.